We are going to blast through this next session. It's a session I would love to spend about 4 hours in, and we only have 40 minutes. So I want you to get at least the main strokes of what I have to say about laying the foundation for an argument and how arguments go bad. Our next session, right after lunch, we're going to be talking about what I call think bombs, fallacies or informal fallacies, ways that people misuse information and try to get you in illegitimate ways, and I will talk about how to deal with that then. But I want to talk something this hour about the foundations of an argument. My page 1 here. Just a second. There it is. Okay. And I'm going to go very quickly, and it may be that this evening, if there was something that wasn't clear, I can take some time and go over it a little bit more slowly. But the main thing that I want you to get here at the beginning is what an argument is. An argument consists of two things minimally. Two things. It consists of a claim about something. A claim, a statement. Homosexuality is immoral would be an example of that. Christians ought not push their morality on someone else is an example of another kind of claim. All kinds of claims that people make. But a claim by itself is not an argument. You must have something else. You must have added to the claim, you must have some kind of support for the claim. That support could take the form of reasons. Sometimes it's called justification. Other times it's called warrant or grounding. Whenever one makes a claim, if he wants the claim to be taken seriously, he must add more to it. He must add reasons, justification, give warrant for his point of view, offer grounding for his view. I had a young lady that came to me at USC, and I was lecturing before their Christian Legal Society there on moral relativism. And when she came up to me afterwards, she said, I am an animal rights activist and an atheist. And I said, young lady, you're going to have a difficult time making sense of those terms. And she said, what do you mean? And she said, I believe that all animals have a right not to suffer. And I said, and I believe I have a right to half of your income to stand to reason. And she blinked at me, and I said, now you tell me, what's the difference between our two statements? You're going to have a hard time, I said, making sense of the notion of rights that animals have that would have to be transcendent rights because the government hasn't given those rights, when there is no transcendent source of rights since you don't believe in God. All she did was make a rights claim. She gave no justification, no warrant, and offered no grounding for her claims. Now, when the writers of the Declaration and the Constitution made their appeal, they made a claim about rights, but they then grounded it. You might recall how they grounded it. They did so very carefully. They said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now, that's very important, that word created. That all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. They were saying there are laws made by man and there are laws made by God. And man can follow man's laws until they violate God's laws. And when they violate God's laws, then you've gone too far. And we can rebel, and that justifies a rebellion against the king. So they made a claim, and they supported it with grounding. And this is a problem with all of the rights claims you hear nowadays. Almost all of them are just make-me-ups. And you're going to have to do better in the public square than just say, I've got a right to this and that. I've got a right to health care. I've got a right to have as many children as I want. I've got a right to have a house. I have a right to live as a homosexual. I have a right to profess my faith as a Christian. All of those right claims need to be made sense of. They need grounding. And that's what makes an argument. A point of view off with reasons or justification that is given why someone ought to believe that point of view. When the young man came to me earlier after the first session, he said, what do you do when somebody says that your claim that moral truths are objective things is just a relative claim in itself? The objection being that moral truths turn out to be subjective preferences. I am not personally, and this is a tactical issue, I am not going to take the burden of proof on myself to try to prove to somebody that something like rape is immoral. If somebody disagrees with me, I'm not going to say, well, you've got an interesting alternate morality. I'm going to say, what's wrong with you? Get help. Because it seems to me that there are certain moral things that are so obvious that the other person needs to make the case for it. So when a person tells me morals are relative, I'm going to ask for support for the claim. I'm going to get the burden of proof off my shoulders because at this point I'm not making the claim. He's making the claim. I expect him to support it. And so my question is going to be, why would you think that justice is not a virtue? Why would you think that intolerance is not wrong? Now, of course, that's his hot button, right? I'm sure. Justice, intolerance, racism, gay bashing. Press their hot button. Why would you think? Because they would have to hold that these are morally benign if they're relativists. What I'm asking for tactically is for them to support their view. It's a very important tactic to employ. You take the claim and you ask for the support. The burden of proof is on the person making the claim. And so when the professor gets up in class and says, well, the Bible's just a bunch of fables. I had a young man came to me and said, my professor says this, how do I refute him? I said, it's not your job to refute the professor. The professor made the claim. It's his job to make good his claim. So when the professor says, the Bible is just a bunch of fables, it's fair for you to say, excuse me, professor, I'm just curious, why do you believe? What reasons do you have to believe that the Bible is a bunch of fables? What is your evidence for that? Now, you're just asking a question as a student, and that's entirely legitimate. Now, professors will pull up a fast one on you at this point. They'll say, oh, prove to me they're not. That's what I call the professor's ploy. What has he done? He has shifted the burden of proof back on you. Don't take the bait. Because it's not legitimate. And at this point you say, well, professor, it doesn't seem to me that it's up to me to prove that the Bible is true. I'm not making a claim about the Bible. As far as you know, I might agree with your point of view. I'm just asking whether you have good reasons to believe that the Bible is a bunch of fables, or do you just simply take that on faith? Are you willing? Well, I don't have time for that. Oh, okay, well, now I know. So I just want to know if you had any evidence. Apparently you don't. You know, if you don't have the evidence, or you don't have time to talk about it, maybe it would be a good time not to throw something as controversial as that out and expect people to believe it just because you say it. Now, I think students, that's very fair, and I don't have time to take the question right now, but Q&A later this evening, bring it up, please. I think it's a fair way to approach them, and if you're kind and gracious, it's entirely fair to let the professor prove his points that he's making it. It's his claim. He's got to provide support. Now, I want to talk a little bit about arguments that people think are arguments that aren't really arguments. Okay? An argument that is a claim without justification is not an argument. It's an assertion. It's a point of view. I should add, it's a mere point of view. So people will come to me and say, how do I refute this argument? Bible's a bunch of fables. And I say, well, it's not an argument, it's a point of view. First get the reasons from him, and then you'll have something to refute. And that's why it's entirely fair when people say things to you, and I really hope you get in the habit of doing this. If you remember nothing else from this lecture, if you remember this, you can really take it to the bank. When people make claims, you get them to justify it. And you get them to justify it by asking them, why should you believe what they just said? Or why do they believe what they just said? If they just make a claim, it's not an argument. It's very fair to say, what is the argument? Spell it out for me. People say, well, regarding homosexual marriage, well, In the past, they outlawed interracial marriage too. Well, they did that, okay. Now what? What's the point? What's the argument? Well, the argument's going to turn out to be, when you make them spell it out, it's like they were wrong in the past. Okay? So therefore, they're wrong now? Why does the fact that we were wrong in the past on the issue of racial intermarriage mean that we are now wrong about the issue of homosexual intermarriage? You see, what you do is you force them to look at the particular issues and make their case. They're going to have to show that they're relevantly similar. And I think there's a big difference between mere skin color and sexual conduct, don't you? And if that's the case, then they aren't relevantly similar. But you never get to the problem of their point of view unless you force them to spell it out. Ask them, what's the argument? When you see points of view that are offered, you ask them, what's the argument? What's the evidence? And then you'll have something to work with. By the same token, if you're a Christian, you should be able to offer some arguments for your point of view as well. Jesus is the only way. All right? Now I understand your point of view. Now make sense of that for me. I found that most Christians can't make sense of that claim. They can point to Bible verses, but that's not making sense of the claim to the non-Christian. And there's a way to do that, and maybe this evening, if you raise the question, I'll deal with that. But we have an obligation to make sense of our claims as well. So one type of argument that isn't really an argument is just a mere assertion. Recognize an assertion for what it is. Acknowledge it. Okay, now I know what you believe. Now why should I take your view seriously? Why should I believe what you believe? Why would you believe that? And I think it's entirely appropriate sometimes to be a little bit stunned when you ask that question. When people make these comments and you say, why would anybody believe a thing like that? I mean, that's amazing. Because some things people believe are really bizarre. And I think it's good for us to be just as incredulous about their statements as they often are about ours. If the statement itself is bizarre, make them defend it. Another type of argument that's not an argument is what I call a phantom argument. Phantom argument. This is really just another type of assertion. I was a broadcaster with another woman who's fairly nationally well known now, and we didn't get along too well on the air. We had different points of view. So we dispute about those points of view, and frequently she'd come up on the short end of the dispute, and her way out of the discussion would be, and we were talking about theological matters, she'd say, well, I have pastors who can refute you. I have pastors who can refute you. Now what is that? I have to think, well, maybe they should be on the air here instead of you. I don't know. But that's a phantom argument. It's kind of like saying there are arguments that could beat your argument. I don't know what they are, and they're not here now, but I win anyway because I say that. Now, the best way to counter a phantom argument is with another phantom argument. And when she says, I have pastors that can refute you, I say, well, I have pastors that can refute your pastors. It's like the professor who said, the Bible's a bunch of fables, and the young man asked him, he said, well, what about, how do you know that? And the professor says, well, I have these books. And he's kind of appealing to this unknown source of information that's not available for you to really pore over and see whether the arguments are good or not, but he just makes this appeal to those things out there. He said, what do I do now? I said, you go, but I have these books. You counter a phantom argument with a phantom argument. Obviously, neither of those things are helpful in the discussion. Got to have something concrete. So that's a phantom argument. Another type of another type of assertion or claim is what I call bedtime story. Incidentally, with regards to phantom argument, it's kind of hard to answer an irrefutable argument the objector knows of but can't tell you. But it does have rhetorical appeal. I mean, it sounds like they make points. And that's the problem with a lot of these inadequate appeals, is that they sound good initially, but they're not good. And your job is to see these things, as we talked about in the first session, and then graciously simply point out the inadequacy. Don't let them make the rhetorical points that they're attempting to make by using this technique. So when they use a phantom argument, point that out. It's like the one that the Bible had reincarnation in it, but it was all taken out. Well, where's the evidence? Well, we don't have any evidence of it because it was all taken out. I mean, this is another phantom argument. It's hard to imagine how it could have been taken out. They say it was in the 4th century at the Council of Nicaea. And think of it, most of the Bible at that time was scraps of paper that were circulating around the Mediterranean. And if somebody wanted to take out the reincarnation that was in there, they'd have to get all these pieces of paper and erase it, which is an impossible task. But that's another type of phantom argument. Another type of assertion is what I call a bedtime story. And Bob Passantino kind of turned me onto this idea. And that's when someone invents an explanation in order to put your argument to rest. He tells a story. And the story may be plausible or may not be, but they offer it as if it's real evidence. Now, I want to make a strong point here. And I think maybe in earlier lectures you had this point made for you as well. An alternate explanation is not a refutation. An alternate explanation of your view doesn't refute your view just because someone offers it. It simply becomes a player in the discussion that requires evidence. I was on KFI, which is a very aggressive talk station in Los Angeles, and I was talking about the evolution issue. And it's a radical non-Christian audience out there. And I was making the case that for design, etc., and a caller called in, and he said that he was a believer in Big Bang. And I said, well, Big Bang actually works in our favor, because if there was a beginning to the universe, there had to be a beginner. And that's equivalent to the creation moment. And he said, and I have to read this to you, because I talked about how everything can't come from nothing. And here's what he said. Well, I don't think it is favorable, because you could start with a base of nothing, and you could say that there was nothing but an infinite universe and a continuous moment. And eventually one tiny little insignificant thing happened. A point happened in the nothingness. And then the point expanded, which is extremely simple, requires no intelligence. So no intelligent God had to intervene. All we needed is a little tiny imperfection in the perfect nothingness. And that imperfection expanded and became variegated and increasingly complex, and soon you had galaxies and planets, etc. Now, how do you deal with that? I wanted to say, are you on drugs? No, but I took the point seriously, because a lot of people think that because they can conjure up in their wild imaginations some kind of explanation, they have somehow put all of your design argument for the existence of God to rest. Think of some of the things he said. He says, a point happens in the nothingness. Well, where did that point come from? And then it expands without intelligence, and there's a tiny imperfection. I don't even know what the word imperfection means in this context. It means that there must be something that's perfect that this isn't. I don't know. But what was interesting was how he started his comments. And I responded in kind. I said, it's interesting how you started your explanation. You said, one could say, and then he gave his explanation. I said, you're right. One could say anything he wants. But demonstrating that what he says is worthy of being believed, that's a whole different story. And I said, all that you did, Dick, is you just told a story. I can tell stories too. We could all tell stories. But we're going to have to do more than just simply tell a story. We're going to have to give some evidence. So bedtime story is something you want to watch out for. When somebody just conjures up some bizarre explanation and has the sense that they have somehow refuted your view because they were capable of simply telling a bedtime story. That's when you want to say, all right, not so fast. Why should I believe that some imperfected dot can come out of nowhere in the nothingness, according to this particular explanation? That's another way that arguments can go wrong. Bedtime story. Nice story, but what does that have to do with the facts? How about the guy who says life as we know it? There's no life as we know it in the rest of the universe, but what if there's life as we don't know it? Well, we don't know about that. So it doesn't play in the game, you know. You look at the way life is developed and you say there can't be life on other planets because of the problems of biology or whatever. And they say, well, what about life as we don't know it? Well, we don't know about that. You can't just throw an unknown in and pretend like it's really something. Life as we know it. It's also good to keep in mind that an illustration is not an argument. This is another type of assertion, an illustration. Oh, all roads lead to Rome. All right? People offer that as if they're making an argument. It's just an illustration. Why should I believe that, religiously speaking, all roads lead to Rome? I want some reasons. So, many so-called arguments aren't really arguments. They're just simply claims. These claims take different forms: assertions, phantom argument, bedtime story, mere illustrations. In each of these cases, what you want to know is what the argument is, not just what the claim is. What is the warrant, the grounding, the evidence, the reasons why anyone ought to believe in that particular point of view. Now let me give you 3 ways that arguments can go bad. Time here. You construct an argument. You have a series of statements that might be considered support of your point of view. You have a conclusion, therefore, and so you have an argument. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. It's an interesting question how you happen to know that Socrates is mortal naturally followed from those first 2 statements. You might say, well, it's obvious. Well, that seems to me a good evidence that rationality is kind of built in. If you ask somebody in the East the same question, they're going to give you the same answer. How does everybody know that that's the right answer? They know it automatically. It's because of machinery in a sense that's built into the structure of your mind, which some people call Western rationality. Well, these kinds of statements are called syllogisms. A series of statements that end in a conclusion. Arguments are often formed this way. Socrates, oops. Thank you. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Okay. Everybody knows that? You can't read my writing? It's okay. It's called a syllogism. Some arguments don't take this official type form. Some are a little bit more strung out, but all have at least a conclusion that's supported by some kind of evidence. Now, there are 3 ways that these kinds of arguments can go bad. One way is that the structure can be bad. This one is obviously true. The structure is right, and everybody knows it. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. The conclusion follows from the premises. The structure is right. The conclusion follows naturally from the premises. You read the premises, and you see that the conclusion is true. There are times, though, when the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. We say all men are mortal. Sally is not a man. Therefore, Sally is not mortal. Does the conclusion there follow? If all men are mortal, if we're using the word men here in terms of male, if all males are mortal and Sally is not a male, does it follow that she is not mortal? No, it doesn't at all. There's a sense in which you can't get there from here. When you can't get there from here, when the structure is not right, when the conclusion doesn't follow naturally, we call that an equivocation. I'm sorry, we call that a fallacy. Oops. A fallacy. Or a non sequitur. A non sequitur. That's actually the term I was more interested in here. Where one doesn't follow from the other. And there are lots of things like that in excuse me, common debate nowadays where the statement doesn't seem to naturally follow. People say, you believe homosexuality is wrong, you're spreading hate. You're spreading hate. Now, my question is, how is it? Now, notice that the conclusion is that I'm spreading hate, and the evidence is, the reason for their conclusion is that I believe homosexuality is wrong, immoral. Now, somebody explain to me, and this is what I would ask, how does it follow that if I think homosexuality is immoral, that I therefore hate homosexuals or am spreading hate? Do you think that I'm wrong in my view? I would offer that to this person. Do you think that I'm immoral in my view towards homosexuals? And many times they'll say yes. Then my question is going to be, then why are you hating me and spreading hate about me? If the rule is that if you think something is immoral, that's spreading hate, then if you think I'm immoral, you must be spreading hate about me. No, that's not the case, and I don't accuse them of that. But that's where their thinking leads. So what I'm pointing at is a conclusion they're drawing about a circumstance that doesn't follow from the evidence. It isn't the case that I hate homosexuals or am spreading hate simply because I think that homosexuality is immoral. I think non-married heterosexual sexuality is immoral too. I guess I hate everybody, men and women, on that standard. So that's an example of a non sequitur, where the conclusion doesn't follow. People say, well, you Christians can't even agree among yourselves. All right? Therefore, Christianity is false. Okay, now explain to me how the fact that we disagree on issues proves that Christianity, when taken as a whole, is false. How does that follow there? See, there's a non sequitur. The structure is wrong. And I can see that. I'm watching for this. I realize that their conclusion isn't really well substantiated by their evidence. So how do I deal with it? Instead of preaching at them and beating them over the head with a logic book, I'm just going to ask them, explain this to me. Straighten this out for me. I'm curious how this follows. So that's the first way the argument can go wrong, when you have a bona fide argument as opposed to an assertion. It can go wrong in its structure. It can also go wrong in its, this would be also maybe the form of the argument. It can go wrong in its facts. An argument can go wrong in its facts. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. This syllogism is called a valid syllogism because it logically follows. If there is no non sequitur and the conclusion logically follows from the prior two statements, it is said that the conclusion is valid. That's on the test. But what if it turns out that even though the thinking is good, the form is good, the structure is right, it's a valid argument, what if it turns out that some of the facts are not right? What if it's not the case that all men are mortal? If it is not the case that all men are mortal, even though the argument logically follows and is valid, then it's not necessarily the case that Socrates is mortal. So sometimes an argument can go bad on its form. Other times the form is right and it goes bad on its facts. Now let me give you some examples of this. Talk to a Jehovah's Witness. You're trying to make a case for the Trinity. Incidentally, we have a real good tape on the Trinity down there. A solution, not a problem. The Trinity is a solution, not a problem. I explain why. He says the Trinity is not found in the Bible. What he means is the word Trinity is not found in the Bible. Now, what he's offering you is not simply an observation. He's offering you an argument in shorthand form. The conclusion that he means to make with this observation is what? The Trinity is not a biblical concept. It's false. All right? He says the Trinity is not found in the Bible. Notice that when he says this, he is really giving you the second premise, called the minor premise, and then he's inferring from that the conclusion. What kind of major premise, first line here, needs to be in place for his conclusion to be valid? Pardon me? Very good. If his argument were this, any true doctrine has to have the words stated in the Bible to be true, first premise. Second premise, the Bible does not have the word Trinity in it. Conclusion, therefore the Bible is not true. Then you would have an argument that followed naturally, right? That would be a valid argument. If it were the case that you got to have the word in there for the doctrine to be true, and it in fact was not in there, therefore the doctrine wouldn't be true. But what's wrong with this? The structure is okay, but there's something else that's wrong. What's wrong is that the first premise that is not spoken in conversation, it's assumed. The first premise is not true. It isn't the case that in order to be a biblical truth, the term itself has to be in the Bible. Now, how do you get at that? You simply ask this question. Are you saying that if the term itself is not in the Bible, it can't be true? You're supplying the missing premise. Now, that premise is false. The facts are bad there. And it's obviously false when you state that to anybody just about anybody who's making this conversation. And they say, no, that's not what I'm saying. And then I say, well, then what's your point? And after a long period of silence, you realize that that his argument isn't going to work. The point is it doesn't have to be the case that the word Trinity has to be in the Bible in order for the Bible to teach the Trinity. The word theocracy isn't in the Bible either, but Jehovah's Witnesses believe in theocracy, that kind of thing. So actually the word Jehovah in their sense isn't even in the Bible. It's an English word of construction from the German. But in any event, this will pop up in other ways. Like Jesus never said anything against homosexuality. Implied conclusion, homosexuality is morally benign. You shouldn't be talking against it again unless Jesus did talk about it. But you see, there's a missing premise there, an invisible premise that would make the argument work. And that invisible premise would be, if Jesus didn't talk about it, then it must be moral. Jesus didn't talk about homosexuality, therefore it must be moral. Problem is that first premise is false. And so if you can identify some of these missing premises that have to be there, where the facts are false, and bring those to light, bring those out into the open, you can show how the argument doesn't work. I'd point out to homosexuals who make this observation that Jesus also didn't speak against gay bashing, or wife beating for that matter. But are we to conclude from that such a thing is morally benign? The answer is no. That's a mistake. Okay, an argument can go wrong in its structure, and again, I apologize for how quickly we're going over this. And I want you to get the broad strokes here. It can go wrong not only in its structure or form, but in its facts. An argument can, third, go wrong in its terms. An argument can go wrong in its terms. And the term we use for this is called equivocation. Equivocation. Equivocation, let me add this, because this is also on the test. An argument that has right form and whose facts are good is called a sound argument. A sound argument. What's equivocation? It's confusing two different meanings of a word and then using those meanings interchangeably. Notice I said all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. What if it turns out that the word man in the first premise is not really the same definition as the word man or men in the second premise? Maybe I'm saying here that all men, and what I mean by men here is all adult males. A man could be a Homo sapien, man, human being, could be an adult male, a man as opposed to a boy, or it could be a male as opposed to a female. What if I said all men are mortal, and I mean adult males? Socrates is a man. Let's see if I want to do this. They got my illustration wrong. Socrates is a man, that is, he is male, but not adult. Socrates is a male, then it would not follow that Socrates is mortal if Socrates was a boy. All adult men are mortal. Socrates is a boy, therefore Socrates is mortal? That wouldn't follow. Because the words mean different things in different places. That's called equivocation. And sometimes the words that are used in conversation have different meanings. You see this all the time in the evolution issue. Well, one is the word evolution. In evolution, there are two types of evolution. There's what's called the general theory of evolution, and there's the special theory. The special theory is microevolution. It's dog breeding. It's finch beak variation. It's moths turning colors. It's just minor variations inside of a species. Macroevolution, or the general theory of evolution, is the molecules to man hypothesis. It's Darwinism. It's the big deal. Microevolution is observed to have happened. Macroevolution has not been observed to happen. What happens is oftentimes in discussions about evolution, there is an equivocation between microevolution and macroevolution because both are called simply evolution. And so you say, where is the evidence for evolution? And they give you evidence for microevolution, and they think they have proved macroevolution. Because you can breed dogs, that means dogs can come into existence out of virtually nothing in the first place. Molecules to man, so to speak. And we're talking about two different things. Sometimes they'll say, don't you believe in evolution? Don't you believe things change? Well, that's a different definition of evolution, just change over time. Of course I believe things change. The kind of evolution that we're concerned about as Christians is macroevolution, the general theory, Darwinism writ large. And a lot of times in the discussion, creationists are shut down because evidence for one type of evolution is used as evidence for another. They get away with it because of the equivocation between the terms. And this is where we need to be very, very precise with definitions. There's another place where this happens in the evolution debate, and I owe this observation to Dr. Philip Johnson, who has written a fantastic little booklet dealing with this issue. It's called Defeating Darwinism by Opening Minds. You can get it in the bookstore. It's a great little booklet. And he has pointed out that there are actually two definitions of science that are used interchangeably but compete with each other. One definition of science is a certain methodology. You do science by the scientific method, okay? That's science. When you do the method, you're doing science. Another definition of science is applied naturalistic philosophy. Science isn't just a methodology, it's a philosophy about the nature of the world. That there are no supernatural forces, everything can be explained through naturalistic processes. Everything can be explained in principle through the laws of nature. There are no miracles, there are no creators. Evolution is the game. Now, what happens in the discussion is those two definitions, which are not the same, they are conflated together. You look at evidence using the scientific method for evolution, and it turns out that there are a lot of evidence against it. Michael Behe has written a book called Darwin's Black Box, in which he shows that biological systems are irreducibly complex. And that won't fit with evolution. It defies evolutionary explanation. And in fact, Darwin himself said, if you find such things, it will prove his view wrong. And so he offers the evidence, doing good science. He's a chemist with impeccable credentials. And when he offers the evidence using the proper method to qualify as science, his conclusions are disqualified because they don't comport with the philosophical definition. And they say, well, Behe, this is just religion dressed up as science. Now, why is it religion? It's not religion because he got it out of the Bible. He actually did the scientific method. It's religion because of the kinds of conclusions that he came to, not because of the method that he used. And you see, this is used to beat up creationists all the time, because the evolution creation discussion is offered or it's caricatured as a discussion between the facts of science as determined by the scientific method and the faith of religionists who won't agree that the world is no longer flat, or they won't agree that the world is round as it always has been. And that's not the case at all, because scientists who are Christians and creationists are very happy to use the scientific method and are able to produce evidence against evolution on that basis. The problem is their conclusions used by the proper method are automatically disqualified. They are pushed off the playing field because they don't come to the right philosophical conclusions. And you see, this is the monkey trial in reverse, where conclusions are disallowed even though they're arrived at by the right methodology because they don't have the right philosophical answer. You can't say that kind of thing in the scientific community. That's not science. What do you mean it's not science? I use the scientific method. No, that's not the philosophy that science must operate under. And so here you have, and Christians are silenced because they don't realize the shell game that's being played. They start out with one definition of science, and then they impose a different definition to disqualify Christian scientists from the discussion. That's an example where the power of the argument is in the confusion of the words. They use equivocation to make their points. So arguments that are bona fide arguments, that aren't just assertions or phantom arguments or illustrations passing as arguments, can go wrong if their form is bad, they don't follow, they're non sequiturs. They can go wrong, even though the form is good and the argument's valid, they can go wrong if the facts are bad. And that's another thing you could be alert to. And finally, it may be that the words are equivocal, that the words are not being used in the same sense in both cases, and it creates confusion. And that's going to take a little closer look in order to find out if that's the game that's being played. If you have an argument in which the form is right, and the facts are good, and the terms are clear, the conclusion is unmistakably true. There is no ambiguity. It is not a mere possibility. It must be true. How can you arrive at true conclusions about the nature of the world? You simply use a good argumentative form. You make sure your facts are right, and the facts will naturally follow. I should say the conclusion will naturally follow if that's the case, and the conclusion must be right. No probability about it. And when the facts are right, the form is right, the terms are unequivocal, the argument is sound. Now, when we come back after lunch, we're going to talk about ways that people illegitimately go after you and non-essential issues instead of going after the argument itself. We'll talk about 5 or 6 what I call think bombs.